Welcome to Intro to Philosophy 1010. Here's our book, The World of Philosophy by Stephen M. Cohn. This is the very first video I'm making for this new book. I've read most of the articles that we'll be going over in this book, but there's a lot of new ones that I have not read before, such as the first reading of the whole book, which I've read now a few times, but it was the first time for this class. What is Philosophy? By Monroe C. Beardsley and Elizabeth Lane Beardsley. So that starts on page 2 of our book. And the way I'm going to go over these videos is, for the most part, I'm just going to go over the questions on the exams and the discussion forums. Because this is a philosophy class, I think people can get overwhelmed by how general some of the questions are, and that's actually a topic the Beardsleys talk about. So just to help you wade through this introductory class in philosophy, I'm going to go over each of these readings like I would if this was an in-class meeting. And so I will start with the first exam questions. Now let me just look at them here. So exam 1, and it's broken up into part A and part B. Exam 1 question 1, what is philosophy? What is its value? Why? And explain. Make sure you refer to chapter 1 readings in constructing your answer. So what is philosophy? What is its value? Why? And explain. So that question is addressed mostly by the Beardsleys, and then we'll see Bertrand Russell and Plato also comment on that, and you would want to bring in the more of the readings assigned for exam 1, the better. And that's going to be the Beardsleys, Bertrand Russell, and then Plato. That's it for exam 1. Plato's Apology, or the defense of Socrates, and the Crito, and the very end of the Phaedo. So, and then part B questions, which are more specifically related to the Beardsleys. Part B, question 1, what is a philosophical question, according to the Beardsleys? Question 2 for part B, what is a philosophical examination, according to the Beardsleys? All right, so we'll be going over those questions, but what I'm going to do is just give a general overview here of what they're trying to do, and I'm going to read some selections from the reading itself, and then we'll come back and look at these exam questions. I'm going back to this video. I hope it doesn't click off. It does sometimes. All right, good. Okay, so let's just start right at the beginning. Philosophical questions grow out of a kind of thinking that is familiar to all of us. The thinking that we do when we ask ourselves whether something that we believe is reasonable to believe. Reasonable has a broad but definite meaning here. A reasonable belief is simply a belief for which a good reason can be given. Reasonable beliefs are logically justifiable. So what is philosophy? This is the most general question. And then the Beardsleys go on to say that we've all had experience of unphilosophical questions because we've all been children who don't ask. They just believe things. Now, right away when I said that, I'm saying, well, children are notoriously question askers. Why? Why does it rain? Because the clouds get, the dust particles condense water, they become heavy and they fall. Well, why does that happen? And then it goes on to infinity. But I'll just read what they're saying. We have all had the experience of accepting beliefs without worrying about their logical justification, for we have all been children. So then they go on to talk about Santa Claus. Little children just accept it. Oh, Santa Claus is real? Okay, Santa Claus is real. And then later they get older, but wait a minute, the Santa Claus on this street corner is about as tall as my dad, but over there at the department store, he's shorter. Oh, then you might say, okay, that they're Santa's helpers. Okay, that helps. And then as they get older, they question more and more. They become more and more philosophical. So, page 3, the left-hand column down there, the last paragraph. The search for good reasons for our beliefs and for good reasons for the reasons can be carried as far as we wish. If it is carried far enough, the searcher finds himself confronted by questions of a peculiar kind, the questions of philosophy. All right, so then they give an example of what would be a philosophical question, and this one has to do with somebody being in jail. On the right-hand column, people sometimes say, he ought to be put in jail for that. So then they say, let's use that as an example of a philosophical question. So suppose you hear your friend remark about the recent conviction of someone who has violated the law, a hold-up man, a venal judge, an industrialist who has conspired to fix prices, a civil rights demonstrator who has blocked a construction site. So your friend says that person, whatever their crime, the jail sentence is deserved. And then you ask, is it really? Am I right if I agree with you? Why? Why would I be right? Just because people made a law in the distant past, why is it morally correct to obey that law now? And then one of the possible answers they give, for example, we may discover that in approving the jail sentence, we are assuming that the existence of a government is so important to maintain that governments have the right, under certain conditions, to deprive any citizen of his liberties. This assumption is a philosophical belief. And when we ask whether or not it is true, we are asking a philosophical question. So this is relating back to these exam questions. And what they're going to say, one way to characterize a philosophical question, that it's very general and fundamental. For example, if you ask a question about, I think their example is a brown cow. The category brown cow is more general than Farmer Brown's brown cow. Then the category of cow is more general than brown cow. So the more general the category that you're discussing becomes, the closer it comes to philosophy. And a fundamental belief is one that you use to support other beliefs, but that it is not supported by them. So the belief in belief in God, and that one's a questionable one. They're saying that's not so general because God is a specific being, and then I'm thinking, well, the idea of God is omnipresent. God's an individual being, and yet God is everything. So it's the most specific and the most general. But at any rate, on page 5, the left-hand column, up at the top, a highly fundamental question is the question about the truth of a highly fundamental belief, and such questions are philosophical ones. So these are just, when you're taking the exam or you're doing the discussion forums, if you can find little sentences like that to quote to support your answer, then it proves to me you've read the reading, and then you'll get a good grade. So I'm going to just keep reading. But to me, when I was reading through that, I thought that was a helpful definition of a philosophical question. It's more general and it's more fundamental. And the deeper you get, the closer it gets to philosophy. Although they do make a point to say on page 5, the left-hand column, we do not know how to set up any rules telling exactly how general or how fundamental a question must be in order for it to be considered a philosophical one. So there's no fixed rule to define the border of philosophy. When does it become general and fundamental enough to be characterized as philosophy? There's no definite rule. They'll go on to say philosophers themselves might not all agree on the proper classification of every question you can think of, but if the demand for good reasons is pressed, beginning with any belief, it will gradually pass beyond the scope of various special fields of knowledge and investigation, and at some point it will bring to light a question that many philosophers would be interested in and would recognize, perhaps with joy, and perhaps, if it is a very tough one, with uneasiness as their own. So then they're going to give some examples. And the details, I'm going to go into some of these details just to give an example of what they're saying a philosophical question would be. So they say, on page 5, the right-hand column, in order to illustrate a little more fully what is involved in the process of examining a belief philosophically, let us take an example from history. Let us begin with the belief that such and such a culture flourished hundreds of years before the Christian era in Central Africa or Nigeria. So it's just a hypothetical scenario. When the historian tells us this, we believe him. But if we have some intellectual curiosity, we might wonder how he knows it. Since the culture has no written language, he cannot rely on documents, and since their thatched houses and all the organic materials they once used in their daily life would long ago have disintegrated in the tropical climate, the African historian has less to go on than his colleagues. So then they get into the details. How do you know that there was this civilization that flourished at a specific century before the Christian era? And they say, well, the usual methods of carbon dating won't work. They're not so effective on organic materials, although sometimes they work. Then another example, because of the rapid decay of dead wood and the eccentricities of seasonal growth, you cannot make much use of dendrochronology. So that's looking at the rings of trees. And then he says, okay, but what about thermoluminescence? In pottery, there are uranium impurities that radiate naturally, but this radiation is trapped until the pottery is heated to a very high temperature. When the radiation rate for a particular substance is known, it is possible to determine how long ago the pottery was baked by measuring the amount of radiation built up in it. So, you're asking to the historian, how do you know that there was this ancient civilization? Well, we looked at some of the pottery, and we used this specific process called thermoluminescence, and that gave us the answer. Okay. Oh, that might satisfy most people. I'm sweating here because this is August 24th. This is 2020. I hope to be using these videos for at least a few years before we get yet another new book. But then the question gets even deeper. Okay. You say that you can check out the pottery and that'll tell you, but how did you determine that? So presumably the physicists, this is over on page 6, will answer something like this. We have tested various samples in our laboratory under controlled conditions and found that the radiation rate is constant. Oh, so over a month's period, you checked the radiation rate of the decaying uranium particles. You don't have to remember all the details of the physics. This is an example to express what is philosophy. So this whole month, the decay rate was constant. It didn't change. So assuming that it doesn't change now, you're saying all the relevant conditions were the same 2,500 years ago, so the radiation rate was probably constant there. Well, they didn't say probably. So the philosopher says, well, how do you know it was constant then? Physicist says, well, things are the same then as they are now, all the other relevant factors, so it was also the same. But then that's an assumption the philosopher will realize, that you're assuming because things are happening in a constant, repeatable way now that they must have always been like that in the past. We're going to see David Hume bring up this point about how do you know the laws of nature. Just because you see things repeatedly happen in one way now doesn't mean they must always work like that in the future and that they always worked like that in the past. And what the Beardsleys say is that's when you leave the physicist behind and you enter the world of philosophy. And they use an example of Harry Truman. So Harry Truman said the buck stops here, and the Beardsleys say the philosophers are where the buck stops of questioning. When your questions become more and more general, more and more fundamental, someone's eventually got to be responsible for answering them, so say the Beardsleys, and that's where philosophers enter the scene. And then they give a few more examples of how you would analyze and examine a philosophical question. And that was one of the exam questions. I believe it was exam 1, part B, question 2, what is philosophical examining? And if you look at the bottom of page 5 on the left, over to the top of the right column, it says, or it may take the form of questioning. All right, let me read that whole paragraph. Bottom of the left-hand column. Page 5. Any thinking that concerns the truth of a philosophical belief is philosophical thinking. It may take the form of accepting a belief as true and investigating its logical connections with other beliefs. This may be called exploring the belief. Or it may take the form of questioning the belief and attempting to determine whether it is based on good reasons. This may be called examining the belief. Professional philosophers are those who have made philosophical thinking their vocation. So examining belief is questioning the belief and attempting to determine whether it is based on good reasons. That's what philosophical examining is. If you're going to answer that question, you would want to refer to that quote there. So then they go through a few more examples. I'll briefly look at them on page 6, the right-hand column. It's dialogue between person A and person B. And person B turns out to be the philosophically inclined one, because that person keeps asking more and more general questions. The first example, you ought to have written to your parents last Sunday. says A. B. Why? A says, because you promised you would write every Sunday. I know I did, but, why is it so important to keep a promise? All right, now you're getting to be a more general question. And then at the end, B says, the majority opinion in our society could be mistaken, couldn't it? I don't see why it should be taken for granted that what most Americans think is wrong and what really is wrong should always coincide. What's the connection between the two? So, from the specific, you should have written your parents because you promised them to the very general. Why should we keep our promises? Just because that's the majority consensus doesn't mean that's necessarily true. All right, dialogue 2 starts like this. A says, in my paper for political science, I had to define democracy. Democracy means government by the people collectively. And then B says, what made you choose that definition? A says, that's in my definition. B says, well, that's in my dictionary. Then B says, well, I've got a better dictionary. And then, that's how A responds. My dictionary is more fundamental. It's better than yours. And then B gets more philosophical. Yes, but language is constantly changing, and words like democracy are used in lots of different ways. Every writer should feel free to define any word as he wishes. Then A says, but that would be chaotic. And B says, why? Why should there be only one definition? So there you go. From the specific to the general, that's the underlying theme of what is philosophy. It's taking a specific question and exploring it deeper and deeper and deeper until you get to the more general question. Then they start to get into another one, which is about free will, which I thought was interesting. Why should someone be punished? Oh, I think I skipped that one, so I'll just talk about it briefly. This was back on page 3 over to 4. Someone got arrested. Oh, they should go to jail. Okay, why? Why should they be punished? Because they have free will. They chose to break the law. And then the question is, how do you know they have free will? What if there's laws of physics that always apply everywhere at all times? Then doesn't that imply we don't have free will, that things unfold necessarily according to fixed physical rules? And if that's the case, then the criminal had no choice. And if someone has no choice, why do you punish them? These are just philosophical questions that we will be examining. So this is why this is the introductory reading. It brings up a lot of points that we're going to be elaborating on later in the class. On page 7, another good reason why to study philosophy is to give meaning of key words. Analyze the meaning of basic philosophical terms. That's over on page 7. So people, especially now, we are in the election season. I don't want to make this a dated video, but we're going to be reading Plato next, in Socrates' court hearing. But at any rate, the point is, you're going to hear a lot of people say, oh, our political party is for justice, or for liberty, or for equality, or for some very general term. But I doubt you will hear even one time any of them try to define that fundamental term. To define a fundamental term like that, you have to ask these philosophical questions, which keep getting more and more general and more fundamental. You have to provide an answer about your understanding of the cosmos. What's the relationship between the individual consciousness and the cosmos? Is consciousness a byproduct of material combinations randomly happening, like Darwinism says, or is there an eternal soul, like we're going to see Socrates suggest as a more likely possibility? Those are philosophical questions, and they're very rarely presented where they should probably be examined much more thoroughly than in any other field, and that's political science among the politicians. We're going to read later in this class Plato's Republic, where he really gets into, he compares a government, especially in a democracy, to a ship of fools where everybody's trying to trick the dim-witted but strong captain to let them take the helm of the ship. The dim-witted but strong captain is the majority. So everyone's trying to trick the majority into giving them control of the ship, and we'll get into that. But the reason I went off on that tangent is that philosophy is required to answer these kinds of fundamental questions, to give clarity to the most basic terms that we use in everyday conversation. And that leads to page 8, where what is the value of philosophy? That was also the Exam 1, Part A, number 1 question. What is philosophy? What is its value? Why? Explain. And in that Part A question, it says, make sure you refer to Chapter 1 readings in constructing your answer. So here's one of the pages you would want to cite if that's the question you choose to answer. So on the left-hand column, increased clearness in your beliefs is then one of the 3 chief benefits you can derive from a study of philosophy. So there's 3. Increased clearness. The second benefit, partly dependent on the first, is increased assurance that your beliefs are reasonable. Why do you believe that? Well, here's my reasons. So they're reasonable. Are they absolutely reasonable beyond question? Probably not. You can probably always continue to question your reasons. This leads to a problem that's called the infinite regress. Why do you have that? Why do you believe that? Because of this reason. Well, why do you accept that reason as the standard of belief? Because of this reason. It can go on, but the farther you take it, at least, the more assurance that you can have that I'm reasonable. I try to be as reasonable as I can be. All right, so increased clearness, assurance that your beliefs are reasonable is the second value of philosophy. And then the third benefit, which the study of philosophy can confer upon our beliefs, is increased consistency, so that your beliefs are consistent with your other beliefs. Well, I believe people who break the law should go to jail. Okay, is that consistent, with your belief? Let's say, hypothetically, you're a Christian and you believe in forgiveness. How can insisting that people go to jail be consistent with the belief that you should not judge others lest ye be judged? So there's a philosophical question. And then they summarize it over on the right-hand column. The 3 values we have cited, clarity, reasonableness, and consistency, are basic intellectual values. All right, so then someone says, yeah, but I want to have increased power to improve my actions. How's this theoretical, conceptual analysis going to help me act better? We're going to see in the section of this book when we get into ethics, Aristotle, for example, will say you'll use philosophy to determine the golden mean of virtue between 2 extremes of vice, one that exceeds the mean and one that is deficient, doesn't come far enough. And that's how reason will guide your actions. So there's a lot of ways philosophy can influence your actions. But what the Beardsleys are going to say is knowledge is valuable enough. It doesn't have to be immediately related to any specific action. They talk about page 9, the left-hand column. Perhaps the growing appreciation of the importance of basic research in science may foster an appreciation of the quest for answers to other highly fundamental questions without insistence on immediate practical results. So in science research, you can have research and development trying to put out a new product for sale, or you can have basic research that just tries to discover the fundamentals of the cosmos, such as how does photosynthesis work? It might not be immediately applicable to any marketable good, but that basic research will inevitably lead to very practical results, but in itself it has value. So say the Beardsleys over on the right-hand column, page 9, yet many philosophers have claimed that the experience of thinking about philosophical questions can affect our emotional attitudes as well as our beliefs. So what's the value of philosophy? Well, for one thing, it can make you happy. So say a lot of philosophers. What's the goal of life? Says Aristotle. I'll turn to him again. Happiness. That's the goal that we seek for itself and not for the sake of something else. We all want to be wealthy, but we want to be wealthy so that we can do other things with our money. But we want to be happy just for its own sake. If we were happy, we'd be content. We wouldn't need anything else. So I'll finish. This is their last paragraph. When we detach our minds from immediate practical matters and from the limited boundaries of particular fields of specialization, we experience a kind of release from petty and provincial concerns. The experience of thinking as human beings who are trying to understand themselves and their universe may produce a serenity and breadth of mind that can in time become enduring. So a serenity, a peace of mind. If you understand the universe, and we're going to see Bertrand. Oh, shoot. You know what? This is... Okay, no. I'm glad. I'm looking on the page here. Page 9 is the end of the Beardsleys article, and it's the beginning of Bertrand Russell's, and it has Bertrand Russell at the top, and I thought, was that Bertrand Russell? he does end his article referring to the universe as well, which is why I got concerned. We'll see this on the next video, page 13. Understanding the universe gives you a sense of serenity and calm. We're definitely going to see that with Socrates, as presented by Plato in the dialogues. Okay, so let me just review what we've gone over here. Part A, Exam 1, Part A, Question 1. What is philosophy? What is its value? Why? And explain. That's what we went over in this video. Those are very general questions, which you can refer to other readings as well. So I'm going to focus on the summary here. Part B, Question 1 and 2. What is a philosophical question? According to the Beardsleys, what is a philosophical examination? According to the Beardsleys. So a philosophical question, you know, is a question that is very general and fundamental. And there's no, on page 5, they say, we do not know exactly how to set up any rules telling us, you know, how fundamental a question must be before you consider it philosophical. So there's no fixed formula to say, that's a philosophical question and that one isn't. But in general, the more general the question becomes and the more fundamental it is, makes it philosophical. And what is a philosophical examining? What is a philosophical examination? On bottom of page 5, left-hand column. So any thinking that concerns the truth of a philosophical belief is philosophical thinking. So if you accept it as true, you might explore it, or it may take the form of questioning the belief and attempting to determine whether it is based on good reasons. This may be called examining the belief. So you take a belief and you examine the reasons for it. That's what a philosophical examination is. And we saw the example of, for example, a historian said, oh, I've discovered this culture in Africa that's centuries older than the Christian era. So how do you know that? There's no written record. It's you know, the structures were made of wood and leaves. They've all decayed. Oh, well, we use this special technique to analyze the pottery. When you heat up the clay to a certain degree, it releases, you know, this is thermoluminescence. When the radiation rate of a particular substance is known, it is possible to determine how long ago the pottery was baked by measuring the amount of radiation built up in it. Oh, that's interesting. How did you discover this radiation rate? Well, we did it in the laboratory. How did you know it was constant? Well, the whole month it was constant. Well, just because it was constant this month doesn't mean it was constant all, you know, 2,500 years ago. That leads to a philosophical question. Are the constants of nature always constant, everywhere in the universe at all times? Just because you see something repeatedly happen in the physical universe now, does that mean that it must always continue in that sequence? Are you sure about this highly general question of cause and effect, causality? Does this always cause that to happen? Again, that's going to be something we're going to see David Hume discuss, and they gave various other examples of a philosophical question. Okay, that's enough, I think, for this first video, for this new book, and the next video will be about Bertrand Russell.